What's going on, guys? John here with Jack for another episode of Talking Ball, and today we will be discussing the Boston Celtics, the owner of the number one pick as we speak in the 2017 NBA draft, and a team that obviously struck gold. They got the number one pick in a trade with the Nets from a while back when they robbed them to get the first round pick this year and next year in exchange for Paul Pierce and Kevin Garnett and a few other pieces. But the Celtics will be looking either to use the pick as trade bait or, of course, to make the selection. And Jack, if they do make the selection, do you think Markelle Fultz is the, without a doubt, 100% player they're going to select?
Oh, without a doubt, I do think it will be Fultz. It's become clear in recent weeks that he's the number one prospect in the nation here, and a guy who is going to be able to impact the team in a number of ways. Obviously, everyone talks about his scoring at Washington, but he's a very good playmaker and is able to create for his teammates. He's also got that long wingspan, which you look for in terms of guys who are going to be able to defend at a high level, next level. There are concerns about how much he affects winning, and definitely a worry of mine. But, you know, as was pointed out on Twitter a couple of days ago, if anyone could name two of his teammates off the top of their head, like I'd love to know. I certainly could not. And so, you know, Fultz really, he's going to come in right away and be able to score, be a dynamic playmaker, and a guy whose defense should develop. Yeah, I do think that's the guy who they'll pick if they keep it, without a doubt.
So that's the guy you think they will pick. Do you think he's the guy they should pick? Because they do have, a kind of a similar version of that sort of player in Isaiah Thomas, obviously. And maybe, or not maybe, I'd say Fultz definitely has a higher ceiling than Isaiah. But Isaiah in his own right is still a very good player if they decide to keep him around.
Right, yeah, absolutely. And for that reason, I was kind of hoping as a Celtics fan that they would lose the lottery,
right,
and kind of come out with the third or fourth pick here, because I do think a guy like Jonathan Isaac would be a great fit. Even Jason Tatum, who's a little bit more ball dominant, but they could really use a wing who can create their own shot and score, because there's so much pressure on Isaiah Thomas. And now, obviously, seeing how they performed in this Cavs series without him definitely raises some questions, just in terms of, you know, their offensive productivity, and because during the season they needed him to score. No one else could do it, and I think there's a bit of a fluke situation going on right now.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
They do move the ball a little bit better, and defensively, obviously, without the matchup liability, they are much better again. So, yeah, Fultz isn't the premier fit in terms of going to the Celtics, but he's the best player, and so it makes sense for sure. But, you know, who would they take in an ideal world if you're going to keep everybody and, you know, don't want to ruffle any feathers? It'd be a guy like Tatum or Isaac or maybe even Josh Jackson.
All right, so moving on here, if they do trade the pick, let's say, for example, they decide to trade down with someone and they pick up a nice veteran or two, and they move down to, let's say, in the 7 to 8 range, something like that, toward the middle to end of the lottery. You mentioned, of course, Jason Tatum and Jonathan Isaac. Besides those two guys, who are some other players you could see them target if they did something like that?
Well, if they move down to somewhere in that range, I think you said like 7 to 10 or so, there is a chance that Jonathan Isaac would still be there, but I'm very doubtful. And so in that scenario, if they did trade down, they desperately need a center or just a big body, really, who can rebound the basketball. And so one guy they may look at targeting is Zach Collins, who I think is just going to be a really solid professional, a guy who in just about 16, 17 minutes a game averaged 10 points and 6 rebounds on a very loaded Gonzaga team, and is just a really solid overall player, a guy who has a lot of things going for him in his game. And you look a little bit further down, and maybe you look at a guy like Ike Anigbogu, the very raw but talented rim runner, center-type player from UCLA, who I think has all the tools to come in right now and be that prototypical center that you look for, who's going to block shots on one end of the court and convert alley-oops on the other end. And right now, that's really all of his game. He attempted less than 10 jump shots, and I certainly don't expect him to be selected in the top 12. But he has that athleticism, that rim running the Celtics really desperately need.
All right, so moving on here to the second round, where the Celtics possess 3 second-round picks, and as we were talking off air, we mentioned that, most likely, if not all 3, 2 of those guys are probably not going to make the roster because they have so much depth on that roster. Who are some names, though, that you could see them picking up that could potentially stick on the roster if they have a good summer league and leading up to the season?
Right, that's a good point here, and just to mention, they got Ante Zizic, and they got Yabesele, Gershon Yabesele. I
sounds right to me.
Butchered his name right there, but he'll be coming. He actually came over already from overseas and played a little bit for the Red Claws there, but then he had an injury. So those 2 guys, Yabesele and Zizic, are coming over as first-round picks from last year. So just to further iterate the point that this roster is just loaded and so deep. They had to cut R.J. Hunter this past season. They just didn't have enough room. So with that being said, I back to the point from earlier about them, realistically, they're not going to be able to get that big early on in the draft. And there really isn't that talented big man who really deserves that top 10 pick in this year's draft who's going to be able to come in and really impact the game like they would need them to. And so for me, that's where you look for, or that's what you look for in the second round for the Celtics in terms of a guy who could stick. And so with that being said, you look at guys like Jonathan Motley, who I think has a nice inside-outside game, potentially Jordan Bell, who's a nice rim runner, showcased really nicely in the NCAA tournament, although a bit undersized for the center position. Maybe even they take a look at Caleb Swanigan, who just announced today, actually, that he'd stay in the draft. He's definitely developed his game a lot, became a much more efficient three-point shooter, and is a elite rebounder, a guy who averaged 12.5 boards a game last season. So there's definitely a few options for the Celtics in the second round of the draft in terms of bigs who could potentially make the roster.
All right, guys, you heard it from us. That's what we think about the Boston Celtics draft chances this season. Let us know what you think, if you think Markelle Fultz is the foolproof #1 pick or not. Remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for listening, guys. We're out.